Hello, my name is Rabbi Margie Klein Rankin. Welcome to RUACH, which stands for Religious Understanding and Community Harmony, or in Hebrew, RUACH means Spirit or Breath of God. This is Lynn Community Television's TV show where we talk about issues of today and of life from a variety of faith perspectives. So I want to start by having us introduce ourselves. Again, I'm Rabbi Margie Klein Rankin with the Essex County Community Organization and Congregation Sha'arei Shalom.
And I am Pastor Jon Niketh from First Lutheran Church in Lynn, and we are just delighted to be here at this new location, continuing with this program.
And I'm Father Brian Flynn, the pastor of the Lynn Catholic Collaborative of St. Mary's and the Sacred Heart, and it is great to be back and to be with these three friends again too. So.
And I'm Reverend Jane Gould from St. Stephen's Episcopal Church here in Lynn, and it's fun to be in the neighborhood of the Common, taping at City Hall.
Yes, well, today's episode, our topic is starting over, which is very appropriate since this TV station and our television show are starting over. And we wanted to think about in the new year, what does it mean to start over with our New Year's resolutions or with trying to make changes in our lives? Or what does it mean more broadly to start over as we have significant changes in our lives? What ways are things always the same and the past is always with us? And what ways can we really create something anew in our lives? So I want to start by asking all of you, in your faith tradition, how does your faith talk about starting over, and how does it encourage people to do that or to, keep connected to the past?
Well, I think for me, in thinking about the Catholic tradition, is the beginning of Advent, the 4 weeks before, the 4 weeks before Christmas, that, preparing for that birth of Christ, but it is the change of the church year. So we start to decide what we want to focus on that this year as, in our case, as a collaborative. It's that beginning again of, preparing to remember the birth of Christ, but preparing to remember that birth again, and what does it mean for us now, and what can it mean for us going into the new year, which again, for the church year, it's like 5 weeks before the calendar changes. And I think as I've gotten older, I think of that first Sunday of Advent as the change, as the beginning of the new year for me. And New Year's still has that significance to it, but it's just, like I said, the older I get, the more I think of Advent as being that starting over point for me.
Yeah, and I'd say further in the Christian tradition, if you go back to what Father Brian was talking about in Advent, the way in which John the Baptist calls people to prepare for the birth of Christ is by turning their lives around, turning their lives back to God, very much in the prophetic tradition of Hebrew Scripture. And I'd say for me, that's part of what's most important about Christian faith, that there is, like as the Apostle Paul says, neither life nor death, nor things high nor low, principalities, powers, all this stuff, nothing can separate you from the love of God. Nothing. We always have that opportunity with God to start over. God's grace and mercy are always there for us, waiting for us to turn ourselves around.
Piggybacking on this Advent theme, it's a wonderful theme, and that each of those readings in that cycle, there's a personal dimension, that something about me and my life will change, but also that the whole world will change, the whole cosmos. And that song that Mary sings on the fourth Sunday when she finds out that she's going to be having a baby is a song that almost doesn't seem possible. The mighty will be cast down and the lowly will be, that it seems, and I think sometimes when we think of ourselves like nothing will ever change for me, or that I'm stuck, or I can never get past this thing, that this whole season and the whole story is based on an impossible thing happening and changing her life for sure, but the course of
But overturning all the power
right.
dimensions of the world as we know it.
the things that feel like they trap us.
Yeah.
I love that idea that you need stories of miracles to even believe that starting over would be possible, because it seems impossible. We're so rooted in our own lives that the idea that there would be a break with the past and something really new could happen, it seems like there has to be the grace of God involved for that to be true. Well, in my life, a major restart has just happened because I just had a baby. You may remember from last season, I was very pregnant. Now I have a cute child. Her name is Oriel, and she's 3 months old. And in the Jewish tradition, I would say the main tradition around starting over is the season of the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year, and kind of like Advent, there is a month-long period before then where we're supposed to spend the whole month reflecting on our lives, doing something called Cheshbon HaNefesh, which means an accounting of our souls. So we're supposed to sort of go through and be like, how was I this past year? What went well? What didn't? And how do I want to act differently? And then on Rosh Hashanah, we spend the whole time, Rosh Hashanah is supposed to be the anniversary of the birth of the world. So it's like we're thinking about God created the world, and we're sort of recreating or co-creating the world and co-creating ourselves anew. And then 10 days later is Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, or we say sorry for all of our sins and ask for forgiveness and get the chance to start over. And I've always thought you really need Yom Kippur in order for Rosh Hashanah to work, because of what we've been talking about, that when you start Rosh Hashanah, you say, oh, this year I'm going to be kinder. This year I'm going to be more patient. This year I'm going to go to the gym 4 days a week, or whatever are those things. But then you know that, this past year you didn't really do all the things that you said you were going to do last year. So on Yom Kippur, we sort of celebrate this idea that you could change, and that we know we're going to make mistakes, and that our starting over has to be coupled with an understanding that forgiveness is possible, so that coupled with our dreams is a forgiveness of the fact that we might not reach it. And so actually the beginning prayer, the famous prayer that we do on the night of Yom Kippur, the service is called Kol Nidre, after the prayer. Kol Nidre, what the prayer actually says is, everything we're about to say over the next 25 hours, don't hold us to it. The reason that you say that is because what you're saying is, we are going to pray with all our hearts and tell you, God, that we're never going to do any of the bad things we ever did, because we want to pray that hard to change. We know that really we can't promise that those things are true, but we're going to pray, we're going to fake it till you make it. We're going to pray like it's really, really true, because it's that depth of prayer that might have the power to change us and to really allow us to start over.
Well, I think in the cycle of the Christian year, part of what's, I don't know about you guys, but part of what I find myself doing as we approach Lent, which is the season of sort of reflection before Holy Week and Easter, I always find myself saying, well, it's really not the time to just reinsert your New Year's resolutions that, you broke by the beginning of February for sure. And so, but when Lent comes, it's like, oh yeah, I can try again. It really is about sort of saying, it is about starting over. It is about recentering our lives on God, but not in the way the sort of secular New Year's resolutions come across, that sort of have that feel of human perfectionism, because that's what I feel like you're saying. It's like we take this time to pray knowing that it's not about human perfectionism. It's about God's desire for us, and how we just deep in ourselves want to live into that as fully as possible, and just mess up, and need to keep sort of claiming that desire in and for us.
I think that you're right, with the Lenten practices, some people, they will look at it as restarting those New Year's resolutions. Okay, now I'm going to lose the weight. Now I'm going to go to the gym.
Yeah.
And of course, we also have those, don't eat meat on Fridays and give something up for Lent, whatever that might be. And people will come to me and they'll get so wrapped up when they ate that chocolate that they said they weren't going to eat, or ate that hamburger because they forgot it was Friday. And one thing I just keep telling them, okay, well then tomorrow don't eat chocolate and don't, But then the other thing that I always tell them, it makes no difference what you're giving up or what you're trying to do if at the end of the 40 days of Lent, you're the same person and no closer or in a deeper relationship with God than you were when Lent on Ash Wednesday. I mean, what difference does it make? What I did, try to make myself that perfect person,
Right.
if it hasn't made any difference in my faith life or my relationship with God. That's what counts. So don't worry about what you're giving up or what you're taking on. Of course, then they run around saying, he says, we can have meat on Fridays.
That's right. I mean, when I think of that for many Christians, the liturgy that begins Lent, Ash Wednesday, and that ritual of getting the ashes smudged on your forehead and the words, remember that you are dust, and to dust that you will return, which is essentially remember that you're going to die. There's this piece in the Christian tradition, and Luther was very big on this, that it's not enough to even just say that you're going to try to change. It is a complete restart. It's dying and rising again.
Yeah.
That me, by my own strength, just say, I'm going to be a better person this year. It is not really what starting over is about.
Exactly.
Starting over, in a lot of ways, like the first step of AA. I am powerless. I need help. I need a community to sustain me. I need God's help. And the sense that I'm not just tweaking myself, but it's a surrender to God's love and forgiveness, and to accept that I'm a child of God, not because I did or didn't measure up to my resolutions, but because God has made me God's child. And there's a freedom then to there is literally a clean slate, and can.
I think there's also that sense of even that daily clean slate, of in the evening, reflecting upon your day, those sins during the day that maybe I committed, asking for God's mercy, and then knowing that tomorrow I start over again. And maybe there's that particular thing that you want to work on that day that, man, I'm always getting angry at that person, or I'm always, and that I'm going to start over tomorrow now. God will forgive me. It's not a sacramental forgiveness for us, but it's a forgiveness, and you can begin again tomorrow to do better. It's very important, I think, also. And the good thing is everybody can do that. I mean, everybody can reflect upon their day and where they could have done better and where they need God's help tomorrow to do better.
Yeah, it's interesting, like in Judaism, in the whole process of Elul, the month leading up, and then also between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we have this idea that you can't move on from any sin that you did, or we don't really think of it as sin, but any missing the mark, in anything that's interpersonal until you go and ask forgiveness from the person. So you have to make amends, like you have to make amends, ask forgiveness, do reparation, whatever you have to do. And only then can you start to ask God for forgiveness. But then you still can't ask God for forgiveness because you have to go through this like 4-step process that you have to resolve you don't want to do the thing. Then you have to make a plan for how you're going to act differently. And you have to resolve you're not going to do the thing. You have to regret that you didn't do the thing. You have to resolve that how you would act differently. And then the full thing is that when you're again in that situation, you have the opportunity to mess up and you actually act differently. So you have to kind of go through that process for yourself before you can even begin to go to God and say, can you forgive me? Because there's this sense, which I always thought it sounded kind of great in Christianity, that you could ask for confession and just be like, I'm sorry, did it, and then, get better. I feel like in Judaism it's kind of like, nope, like you have to like get really far along and And then at that point, you actually have to change, and then God will consider talking to you.
Well, you gave me some talking points for the confessional this
Right.
weekend.
Well,
Did you know if you were Jewish?
Well, and that I think is, I think a healthy or full understanding of confession and forgiveness in the Christian tradition would pull in those pieces, perhaps using different language, but and I almost sometimes have trouble with, at the beginning of the Eucharistic liturgy, there's usually a rite of, penance, and it's so brief and it's so perfunctory almost that it's not the same as being one-on-one with a pastor or priest, or one-on-one with another human being who you've run. Not that I want to get rid of that, but I that can't ever be it, because it gives people the sense that starting over is as simple as going through a ritual, when the ritual is meant to signify a deeper reality, or even make possible the deeper reality.
But am I right, in the Lutheran tradition, you all, during Lent, there's no absolution?
There are
right?
some, well, that was the tradition at a time, that the absolution that would come at the beginning of the service was withheld until Maundy Thursday, when there was an individual laying on. We still do the individual laying on of hands and absolution, but usually sometimes it's called the Declaration of Grace, where it's not using the I absolve you formula. But I would never want to say God wouldn't forgive someone during Lent, so it's not that kind of.
But I thought theologically that was interesting, that taking this season, which sort of is claiming more of the Jewish tradition out of which we come, that, when you are in a church that has taken on sort of as core theology that by God's grace, we're all forgiven, right? Whatever we do. So, you've got the story of the prodigal son who wanders off, spends everything, engages in every illicit behavior possible, and ends up sort of sitting in a pigsty fighting the pigs for food, and goes, wow, the workers at my father's farm are doing better than I am. I'm going to go back and tell him, I'm not fit to be your son. I don't want anything. I'd really like just to work on your farm. I will work hard. You can disown me, anything. And his father goes, the lost has been found. I welcome you. I love you. You're mine. And his big brother thinks, this is such a bad plan, like so unfair. There's no making amends. There's turning back, but no making amends. And I think a lot of Christians side with the big brother, that it's like, this is just wrong. And the teaching of the church is, and this is what God does for us again and again and again, that when we've made decisions that bad, even if we make no amends at all, God will let us back. And so when I learned about the Lutherans sort of holding Lent open the entire season of like, you confess, but we're not absolving you until we get to Holy Week, I thought, wow, like that's really sort of forcing folks to engage what they've done that has missed the mark.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's where that tradition developed. The thing that I find is just, Luther's, what drove him was always that people heard the good news. And there are times when people need to be reminded that they have missed the mark. And then there are people who are obsessed that they always miss the mark.
Right.
And you could absolve them 100 times and they still feel like they are bad people, that they are not actually forgiven, and that they inflict that upon themselves and other people every day. Yeah. So it's like, which word do people need to hear? Do you need to be set free, or do you need to be reminded that
turned around?
Right, and perhaps a healthy confession or whatever would discern what exactly was holding the person in bondage. Perhaps their own. I mean, and this goes back to the kind of question we started with: can you ever really start over? Well, theologically, sure, God says you can start over, but can you start over? Like, can you actually grasp onto that and then allow the ritual to transform you? Well, God says I'm forgiven, therefore I can truly be a new person, versus, well, I don't really forgive myself. I'm going to keep living as if I'm this shriven, awful soul who deserves punishment, and interpret everything bad that happens in my life as God's punishment on me.
That's actually an interesting piece of theology I was reading about in rabbinical school in terms of a piece of feminist theology that was talking about how like traditionally in Judaism it's like, I was bad, I did horrible, I am the worst person, I did all these things wrong, and the orientation is around saying, get off your high horse, you are not as great as you think you are. And what this woman said is, that's what a lot of people need, but actually a lot of women have been taught that they're terrible and not to speak up their whole lives. And so what they actually need in order to start over is much more a sense of, you're okay in the first place. And so instead of going like this, they say you should go like this, just like wipe it away. Like it's going to be okay, which I think is, I think that's nice to have that for some people. You kind of have to figure out what is the piece that is going to allow people to start over
for freedom.
For different kinds of people.
I was just thinking, just going back a little bit when you were talking about the repenting and what you had to do before you could even go to God for the forgiveness, is there is some of that element in the confessional, in our tradition, in the sense that, I'm always looking for, if you can go to the person and say, I'm sorry, or see, you encourage that. Now it doesn't, there has to be the intent that you're not going to do this again. And someone comes and confesses, I rob a bank every day, and what are you going to do tomorrow? Rob a bank? Well, then, that doesn't count. I can't forgive you for that sin. And then that idea of when you do find yourself in that situation, to act differently. Now, you discern that as you're in the conversation with the people, and you grant them the absolution in 99% of the cases, except the one where they may say they're going to do the sin again, they're intending to do the sin again. But I just found that fascinating, how just thinking about what's going on in the confessional, how those elements are there. And then getting back, when we talk about giving that mercy, well, Pope Francis, of course, has been to the forefront of that, which has caused divisions in the Catholic Church. He's not making them pay for their sins. He just wants us to forgive them. And that's been a lot of conversation.
And I do think that mercy can change people. There is something about, and that's the whole order thing is interesting. I can see that very much, that in order to even approach God and ask for forgiveness, I need to make amends with the person I've harmed. By the same token, there are times I can think of in my own life when the experience of being forgiven or receiving mercy changed my heart, where the gift preceded the change. So, it's God's love is a funny thing.
And there are a lot of stories. All of our traditions are not monolithic. So in the Hasidic tradition, which is a sort of charismatic populist tradition from the 18th and 19th centuries, there are all these stories about like the person doing the wrong thing and shows up at Yom Kippur having eaten a lot and drunk and passes out on the floor and wakes up and hears everyone praying and cries out and interrupts the whole service, and everyone's looking at him like, how could you do this? You're interrupting the service. And the rabbi says, this is the only reason any of us will be forgiven this year, because this man, when he woke up, I saw into his heart that he was truly praying and he was truly sorry. So there is this sense that true regret and desire to change is enough, but you at least have to get there. You can't just be like, oh, can I please be forgiven because I would like to stop being guilty. It's you have to, if you have that really genuine desire to change, that is actually, in a lot of the stories, considered to be enough. And I was just thinking about how also, we have this word, tshuva. That's what we're doing the whole time. It means, people usually translate it as repentance, like you have to repent. But the actual translation of it, there's two. One is to return, and the other is to answer, like to answer a question. And so it's like, what is the you have to kind of think of, what is the question I'm being asked that I'm showing up for synagogue and answering this year? That's one way of thinking about it. And the other is that this idea, which I think different Christians have different ideas of it, but it is very fundamental in Judaism, that like, you are good, your soul is pure. And when you falter or go the wrong direction, that is not really you. That's somehow you've sort of gone astray. But what you're trying to do is go back to your true self. And so what repentance or returning is all about is trying to figure out what was the path that you went on. So as an example, one of the teachings that has this thing, like if someone committed adultery, right? So nobody thinks that's a good idea. Adultery, bad. But what was the impetus to do it? Probably that you had this desire to love or for connection in some way, which was not being fulfilled fully in your life in some way. And so you went down a really bad path of how you tried to get at that. But if you trace it back, there's something in you that is that desire for love that you might be able to find in a healthier way, and that is a life-affirming and holy piece of yourself, which you've then just denigrated in some way. So I wanted to sing one line of a song that we sing on Rosh Hashanah. That's like translated into English conveniently, and it goes like this: return again, return again. Return to the land of your soul. Return again, return again. Return to the land of your soul. Return to who you are. Return to what you are. Return to where you are, born and reborn again. Return again, return again. Return to the land of your soul. So there's a sense that
we
you're
could
like
steal that one
easily.
Constantly just like
Nicodemus'
trying to get back to like
song.
who you really are, which is good, which I find to be inspiring, as I'm like, oh, I did this bad thing, I did this bad thing, I can't, how am I supposed to start over? And it's like, no, but like who you really are is awesome.
Yeah.
Well, and I think and this is the idea of sin in Christianity that has been the popular understanding that it's sort of these individual bad things you do versus the consequence of a broken relationship or something in myself that's hurt or marred. I think we need to restore that, which I think is completely in line with our theology, that we are. There used to be a confession that Lutherans would use, which fortunately we don't use, and it was, I confess that I am by nature sinful and unclean and deserving it. It's like, that's actually heretical. No, you are made in God's image.
Yeah.
And some of the newer ones, like when the one we use on Monday, Thursday often is that God's image has been marred in me. Or it's that you are, it's the reverse of that. You are God's child, God's beloved, and something has hurt that relationship. But it's not that you are an awful, sinful human being. It's that, how do we restore that relationship? And I think that goes for individual sins, like, unless I just did this with sins, we're going to get phone calls now too. No, individual things like adultery, that what's underneath that, and social. We talk about poverty and racism as social sins. Well, what's underneath all of that? It's one thing to do these sort of external fixes, but what's at the root cause, and how do we repair those things? To get back to who we are.
Well, and that does get at that whole, can you start again, right? So many of the people I talk to day by day have been so deeply wounded by betrayals of trust at some point in their lives that, whether it's hard to think of themselves as of value, or it's hard to get themselves back on a track that is sort of within the bounds of the law, or but it really it goes back to sort of root causes that got planted at a point where it was maybe an active choice about a particular activity, but not really in a context of having agency or ability to direct life because of this sort of root stuff going on. And we've got that same thing culturally. When you look at the, quote, social sins, when you look at racism, when you look at poverty, you're looking at root stuff culturally that we say, so how do we start again in this country given genocide of Native Americans, right? I heard on the news this morning Amherst College debating, should we get rid of being the Lord Jeffs because he gave smallpox blankets to Native Americans. That was a good way to get rid of them as British policy. Is that what you want your sports teams named after, as a small New England college? How do we start over from there?
I was just thinking about a sermon I gave a few years ago on this topic that was reading a source, this Rabbi R.U.A.C.H, who was the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel, or the first chief rabbi of Israel. I think it was also before statehood. And he has this thing that there are 3 levels of starting over. One is that you look at the past and what you did wrong, and you're like, I hate that. Now I'm going to try starting over. Doesn't work that well because you're really connected.
Those are the resolutions.
Right, because then you're like connected to what it was before. Another level is to say, I have this vision of what I could be, and then I want to like attach myself to that and like pull myself towards it. And that's a little better because then you can keep on the thing that you're looking at, keeps drawing you forth. But it's really hard also because you haven't experienced it, and everything in life is kind of like the momentum is to just be, it's objects in motion stay in motion, objects at rest stay at rest. And then the third is to understand that you are this integrated child of God that is on a path, and that everything that's happened so far is all part of your path towards closeness with God. All the things you did that you liked were part of it. All the things that you didn't like were part of it, because they all got you to this moment right now, which is a moment of opportunity and a moment of possibility to get closer to God. And that when you think about it like that, like now is an opportunity to get closer to God, and now is an opportunity, and just over and over again, that's actually the place from which you can act authentically at all, or you can start over, because you understand that you're not actually, that you're totally tied to your past, but in a way that doesn't determine how you have to live your future. Mm-hmm. It just creates the story that you get to continue.
Yeah. Yeah, I've told that to people so often. I mean, we can't get rid of that past. It is a part of who we are. But how much of an effect that past will have on us?
Right.
We have some say in that. You know what I mean? And I often use the story, what you're saying, when I tell people about my vocation story. I didn't enter the seminary until 37 years of age, and so and now that I know I'm where I belong, and I've known that since pretty much I was in the seminary, I was always looking back. Why didn't I do this at 25 when I could have? Why did I do this other journey? But then you just got to realize, because you needed to do that other journey to get you to that where you are today. I mean, it's it wasn't even on my mind at 25, and even if it was, it probably wouldn't have worked at 25.
And you could be of use to people in a different way now that you've had this particular journey.
I mean, I think I'm where I'm supposed to be. I know I'm not going to be here forever, and I don't mean to Lynn, I mean a priest, but what's that next part of that journey? What's it going to be like? And what's God going to be calling me to do? Am I going to recognize it, when God's calling me
Right.
to do it? Am I going to have the courage to say yes? And because that's what I had to do, 15 years ago. Recognize it and have the courage to say yes to it.
Yeah.
It sort of changes the whole idea of starting over, because I'm sure you could tell a story of how you came to that conclusion, and probably to make some major life changes. To quit your job, to go back to school, to invest a lot of money, to make these vows, to become.
Stop reminding me of my past.
And yet, Father Brian the priest, had he been ordained at 25, is not the same
Correct.
person as Father Brian the priest, having had those years as a former occupation. So it's starting over, and yet you are who you are based on what came before.
Right.
Yeah.
Have you felt like you've had opportunities? I know, Father Brian, you kind of said, starting over, becoming a priest, but what have been experiences in your lives where you have started over, or you've witnessed someone starting over, and how has that affected you?
I left the first seminary I was at, which also meant leaving the denomination that I was. There are different types of Lutherans, and so in this grand scheme of things that one does in life, that's a pretty small change. But at the time, it felt like a huge change. It was breaking some ties. It was reapplying, and all kinds of financial aid stuff was up in the air, and it was going to make a lot of people upset. But I knew in my heart it was what I had to do, because my own self and my understanding of God was more aligned with with the ELCA, the more progressive, inclusive of the. But I distinctly remember the fear at the time of disappointing people, of letting people I deeply loved down, of the uncertainty of what was going to be next for me, and all the processes tied up around becoming, candidacy committees and bishops and all the. There was, at some point, it had to get to the point where it's just intolerable, which is probably not a healthy model for making changes. Waiting till it gets to that point, but sometimes that's what it takes. Where I just can't do this another day. And filling out the paperwork in my sort of little study, so.
But that's an example of how the value of that bad moment is that it was the fulcrum that could change your direction.
It's true, and I do look back on that as, so in Scripture when it talks about being in the wilderness, I feel like I can identify with that more, and that feeling of being without a home, or feeling like the place you're in is not the place you're meant to be. I can understand that from a personal perspective now. So say, would you do it differently? Well, maybe, probably, but at the same time, I don't regret having that experience.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, when John's and my sons were 5 and 1, my husband was a teacher. He got a full year sabbatical. I'd just finished my first job, and we'd both been working full-time with 2 preschoolers. Well, a baby and preschooler. And it was like, yes, we're going to get to study. We're going to have time to ourselves. We're going to Oxford, England. It's going to be the best year ever. And after we'd been there a couple weeks, the week our 5-year-old started school, he just started throwing up everything he ate. And after a while of throwing up everything he ate, he decided he just wouldn't eat anymore. And we were dealing with the British Health Service, and we were saying, we think it's emotional. This isn't how he acts. And then, they were like, no, little boys can't do that. His tummy must be hurting. And we're like, no, that's not. And he dropped from 60 to 40 pounds. And he gave all his Ninja Turtles away. So we kind of started we can't do this. And so we just bailed. We had a lease for a year. We were like, we didn't know whether we had a place to live when we went back, because the school where my husband taught, they'd put someone in our house, and we were just like, we don't care. Like, we have to go back. And it really was a starting over as a family, because first of all, we had to, when we got back, teach him that he couldn't, by not eating, like, run the family forever. But we also knew that there were ways in which we needed to pay attention, that we just had been working so hard and so fast and so much, we just hadn't noticed. And for Jon and me, it was really a starting over of being ready to tell our stories, right? Not to say, oh, he was bad, so we had to come home, but to say, we loved him enough to come home and work together as a family that we all could be healthy. We couldn't just say, you must comply. And, you know, it really, I think, changed the way we worked. And so, you know, as life evolved and we discovered that this very bright little boy did have a learning disability, he had been tossed in an English classroom with kindergartners to second graders, and everyone could read, and he was just traumatized because he was smart enough to know that he should be doing something he simply couldn't do. And he just internalized it all. And you think, oh, they can't do that at 5. But they could. He could. And it really, like, we, because of trauma, got to start over. And we sometimes think about, well, what would have happened if we just put him into his, you know, the local public school? We probably would have been the parents in the room saying, he's really smart, you all are screwing up, right? Like, you know, we would have been clear, and we would have been fierce and feisty. But because of that traumatic experience, we were ready to listen and work as partners with him and with any medical, psychiatric, teaching authority. So I think starting over isn't, like, it can be really painful and hard, but transformative.
It sounds very humbling, kind of like that, like,
radically.
man plans, God laughs kind of thing,
Yeah.
that you guys were just on your trajectory,
It was
and then it was
perfect.
like, nope, that's not your trajectory, so start over.
Not happening.
I feel like for myself, I mean, I can think of various different points, but really I feel like right now is that for me. I had this feeling when Oriel was born that, you know, she was clearly starting, but I was being born again as a mother. Like, I was a different person. You know, now I'm in the infancy. I'm 3 months of a mother, or 3.5 months, and it's just been interesting. Like, my priorities have changed. Like, I really feel like I would die for her. Like, I didn't know this person like 15 weeks ago or whatever, and now I'm like, I would like lay down in front of a truck to save this person. I love her so much. I mean, God forbid that would happen. I'm
Let's
very
not
violent.
have that choice.
But, like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm just like, wow, like, you know.
You'd come back from England for her.
Yeah, like, I would do so much for her. And, you know, when I was going back to work, I had this sense, I was saying this to Jane the other day, I had this sense of, like, I used to go to work when I wasn't a mother, then I was a mother, and that meant being home on maternity leave, and now I'm going back to work. Like, I kind of had this fear of, like, what's going to happen to the baby? Like, maybe I won't have the baby anymore because, you know, working Margie doesn't have kids. And I was so stressed out about it. And when I went back, it was great because I actually love my work and, you know, remembered this other part of myself. But I had to think about, what does it mean to be an integrated person? Like, to add this major new reality to my life. And then I had 3 months of adjusting where all I did was connect with that new person, that new reality. But then how do I become whole? And part of me felt like, I feel like our society teaches us that you are like one thing or you're another thing. And you're supposed to just, you know, like you're supposed to be a mother or you're supposed to be a worker. And this woman, someone that a friend of mine's friend, who works at a bank, was told, while you're here, you are not a mother. And it's like, that is the actual message. And then I feel like other people have gotten the message like, oh, you're not really a good mother if you're leaving your children to go to work. And I was just thinking about what would it mean to be reborn as a person, or to be a mother that wants to teach Oriel or teach, you know, the next generation. You can be your whole self. And that means being a mom and being someone who's passionate about making the world better in the ways that's what my job invites me to do. And it's like all these things that are just basic things, like going to work, like I'm having to have a whole revelation to figure out how to integrate it into my life. And then when I get home, I'm like, what am I supposed to do? You know, do I go to sleep, or do I play with my child, or do I go to the gym? Like, you know, it sounds kind of trivial, but it's really like this, everything is a major new choice and a new reality. And I feel it with such a sense of joy and blessing, but I can imagine a similar kind of transition happening sort of, you know, in the other direction. If you lose someone that your whole life has been about, you know, being the partner of someone. My family has so many friends who are widows, you know, my parents' friends, and just thinking about the ways that they have had to start over and sort of integrate this new identity into every single thing that they do. Now they're doing it with this new set of emotions and set of priorities that must be, you know, overwhelming and confusing and potentially generative of new life in new ways that you might not even expect.
Well, like Brian, the guy who is our biggest fan, who we buried this morning.
Right, Ed Canton, who St. Mary's sacristan, who you know, died suddenly on Sunday. And he's a man who was quiet but was around St. Mary's and did so much for us. But now, like St. Mary's, the world is shaken in some ways because of so much that he did. And now it's like life without Ed. And you're right in the way I'm asking those questions. You know, do I have to do this now? Because, you know, and other people are asking the same thing. It's not just me. And I was thinking, as you're, you know, talking about losing someone, you know, my father died at 50, and I remember my mother, you know, looking at us, her sons, is it okay for me to do X, Y, or Z? You know what I mean? Because it was no longer her and her husband, it was her. And again, it's that starting over as that new person, or she's not that, you know, the couple was as one in a sense.
Mom and dad.
That's right. Now she's alone, so, you know, what does she do? And asking those same type of questions, you know. But
and it brings up that sometimes we choose to start over. We hit, you know, rock bottom in some way and say we feel inspired to do something new. But sometimes it just kind of happens, and it's like, okay, I guess I have to start over. When you have people in your congregations or in your life that, for one reason or another, whether it's losing a loved one or experiencing an illness or something happens where it's just like, go, start over, what kind of support or advice is useful, or do you give them?
With those kind of like incredible life disruptions or passages like a death, I think that there's certain things we can do to uphold people in community and to help them imagine that they are still a whole person, and that they're who they are as a child of God is constant. And at the same time, things like support groups. Sometimes the only people that really understand are people who have lived through that and can empathize.
Well, and I think so often our culture wants folks to start over fast.
Yeah.
Right? You've grieved long enough. You know, you've been down.
Can't even call
time
a funeral
to get up
a funeral.
And go.
It's a celebration of life. You know, you can't even mourn for a day.
And I think that starting over takes time. And you know, I guess that's part of my teaching is about give yourself the time and space you need, because life has a new landscape right now. And so you can't move through this landscape in the way you move through the old. So it's a new journey, it's a different journey, and you'll need to figure it out as you go, but you're not alone. That's what this community is here for.
I think, the lines I just keep hearing myself say is, that's okay. You know, if that's what you're feeling, and that's okay, because that's where you're at. And, you know, you're right, you can't compare it to, well, so-and-so was over the funeral in a week, and you know what I mean? That's where that other person was. You're where you are, and it's okay, and we'll learn together in a sense of where the journey's taking you.
Yeah, and you know, I think for the people watching, I feel like, you know, some people may have an experience of they choose to start over, and other people, you know, you may have experienced that you don't have a choice. But I think, you know, if there's something that's in common among all of us, even if we have different faith traditions, it's that community is such an important piece, and that you can't really do it alone. When you have to start over, like, I mean, I'm blessed that had the option of choosing when to become a parent, and, you know, I've had to go to I've gone to these moms groups. They've been so helpful, because even though I thought I would know what I was doing, turns out I need a lot of help, and I think we all need a lot of help to start over. So if you're watching this, I encourage you to get as much support as you can as you make choices to begin again, or you just have to experience beginning again. That's something that can be a beautiful or a painful experience, but one that really can invite support. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in and watching us this month. And next month we will be talking about love and relationships. So that should be an exciting topic, and we look forward to seeing you
miss
then.
Tell all.
Yes, tell all.